We are giving a shir this morning, which is something very significant in my opinion. It concerns the question of the soul of a Jew versus the soul of a non-Jew. Recently there was a shir that was given in a Midwest city by a certain Rav, and the Rav in that Midwest city got up and said, incredibly, that non-Jews have no shaychus to the Ribono Shel Olam. This is a major Talmud Chacham who got up and said this to the uproar of his community, who could not believe it. The question is that an accurate statement? What is the relation between Jews and Ribono Shel Olam and non-Jews and Ribono Shel Olam? Now, this is supposed to be a 2-hour shir as it was given to my Kehila in Cincinnati. However, we were given 45 minutes to do it here, and now we're given 35 minutes to do it here. Right. So if you can understand, we're going to have to run through the material a little more quickly than I'd like. We're probably just going to have to do my translating it instead of going through it in the Hebrew and the sources. We're never going to make it. Originally there were 40 sources. Now I've limited to 25 sources for our purposes here. Let me announce that when I went to Rav Hershel Schachter at last year's convention, and I mentioned to Rav Schachter that I wanted to speak about this topic and how I believe I could prove that non-Jews have a soul which is the same as the Jews, Rav Schachter says, why would you want to do that? It's not true. It's not true. The idea that the Jews are closer to God is expressed in Pirkei Avos by seeing that, in fact, they are like children to Ribono Shel Olam. So I expected that from Rav Schachter. I was not surprised. I then went to Rav Willig. I said to Rav Willig. Rav Willig said, no, if you can prove it, prove it. I don't think it's one Ikrei Amuna. If you can prove it, prove it. I then went to Rav Gedalia Schwartz. We consider these, some of us, the posting with the RCA. And Rav Schwartz said, of course it's the way you're saying it. Absolutely. There's nothing to talk about. Of course everyone has the same soul. It's not that Jews have a different soul. Again, I was not surprised, knowing these three individuals pretty well, that these were the responses. But that's kind of the backdrop to the controversy you see involved in this question. Let's look now at the sources. You should have a source sheet before you. If you don't, they are up here. Again, we're looking at 25 sources out of 40. You can get the full 40 if you want afterwards, if you are still interested. The main source that most people know for this particular issue is source number 1, the Baal HaTanya. The Baal HaTanya says, and again we have to do it in light speed, the Baal HaTanya says that the soul of a Jew comes from a certain aspect where there is also good in that soul, as opposed to the soul of, he says, the idolatrous nations, Obdei Gilulim, who do not have any good whatsoever, the language is, within their soul. He then goes on to say in source number 2 over on the left, he said, V'nefesh hashenit b'Yisrael hitchelek elokam imal mamish. He says that Jew has a soul that has a portion from Ribono Shel Olam in him. He explains that God blew part of his soul, of his essence, into the human being, and consequently that's why the Jew, he says though, the Jew, not the human being in general, but the Jew has within his very nature this godliness and this divine essence. Now, it's interesting, there were those who lived at the time of the Baal HaTanya who tried to explain already that this is only talking about idolaters who do not have this divine soul. But let's say Chasidei Umot Ha'olam, those who are righteous of all nations, they would have this particular soul. This is difficult to say for various reasons. Number one, it's clear he's trying to say that Yisrael versus others. Otherwise, if it's Yisrael, what's the big deal? The pasuk he quotes is only by Yisrael. It's not by non-Jews as well, no matter how good those non-Jews are. Furthermore, the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself, who could we ask for as a better interpreter of the Baal HaTanya? The Rebbe himself, in a letter that was written to him by someone who was afraid that this language might start a pogrom, and therefore it should be taken out of the new translation of the Tanya that was just made. This was shortly after the Holocaust. So the Rebbe said that there's nothing we can do about it. Obviously we can't change the Baal HaTanya's words. And then he says this is the crux of the matter. In our day and age, one does not have to be a Chassid or even a Kabbalist in order to believe this way. As long as one does not close one's eyes to the stark fact to see what kind of souls the nations of the world have. For all the nations of the world were witnesses to what was going on in Germany and the countries it overran, yet remained indifferent. In light of this, the words of the Alter Rebbe, he says, may even be an understatement. An understatement that there is no good whatsoever in the souls of non-Jews. It's amazing. What about the non-Jews who saved the lives of Jews during the Holocaust? What about that? Again, Lubavitcher Rebbe also in 1960 in an interview that was had with some college students that he was speaking to. So there, when someone asked him about the question of Jew versus non-Jew and the spark of a Jew in every individual, the Rebbe said, a non-Jew, listen to this, and every created thing has a divine spark, but it is not the same divine spark as a Jew. Now understand, you might say, oh, so he says non-Jews have a divine spark. But you understand, he's saying, yeah, just like a chair has a divine spark, and a plant has a divine spark, and an animal has a divine spark, so too a non-Jew has a divine spark. So the Rebbe had the opportunity to clarify what he means. If it's Chasidus Olam, we're not talking about non-Jews who are tzaddikim, we're not talking about those type of non-Jews. He had every opportunity to do that, and he did not, because he won't. So you see, this is not the problem of the Baal HaTanya. The Baal HaTanya was just quoting earlier sources. The Baal HaTanya did not make this up. The Baal HaTanya got this, first of all, the Sefer Tau in source number 3, which is of Shabtai Yisrael Harvitz. This is in the 16th century. Already, him also quoting from Kabbalistic sources, already says that the Jewish soul is a chelik mamish. He says, is mamish a chelik from the Ribono Shalom, just like the Baal HaTanya said. And if you see, he quotes in here again, we don't have time to do it inside, but if you look through the source number 3, you'll see that he says it's just like you have a portion of something. If it's broken off from the entire entity, so that portion is just like the entire entity. It's not in its whole nature. So he says the Jew is like mamish, a part of God. It's the part of God that was taken off. Now you had to write a whole separate treatise because you can understand theologically. What do you mean? You have God and He's taken apart and He's given every little part into every individual. Is that theologically sound? Would someone understand God as being able to be broken apart into different pieces? So he had to answer this question in a separate treatise that he wrote. But nonetheless, this is his view, and it's not the view alone of the Baal HaTanya, but in fact of all Kabbalists. If you look at source number 4, this is what we're concerned about. We are not Kabbalists, most of us. However, we know Gemara, hopefully. And the Gemara says here, this is the source for this whole view in the Gemara in Baba Batra, Daf Yud Amud Bet. The Gemara says, Tanya Amar Lahen Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, and follow, I'm going to have to translate for time's purposes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to his students, we have a pasuk in Mishlei that says as follows: Tzedakah tiromim goy v'chesed l'umim chatat. It says that righteousness or tzedakah will elevate the nation, and loving kindness of the nations is chatat. What does that mean, that loving kindness by the nations is chatat? So, it says, Rabbi Eliezer says the following. He said, V'amar tzedakah t'romim goy elu Yisrael. When it says tzedakah will elevate the nation, what nation? This is the Jewish nation. Yistiv u'mikamcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. V'chesed l'umim chatat, and the loving kindness of the nations is a chatat, is a sin. Kol tzedakah v'chesed shumoto v'kofim motzin. Whatever non-Jews do in terms of loving kindness, chet hulahed. It's a sin. She'ein amosin ela lehitadel bo. They only do it to become great when non-Jews even do chesed. Even non-Jews who saved Jews during the Holocaust, they do it just because their name will be known, their names will be written somewhere, they'll be forever remembered. It seems to say that's why they do it. That's why they do it. Very difficult to understand. That's what he says. The Marsha says Likadelbo means that they will be given long life. They do it so they will get long life from whoever their God is. That's why they do it. Nanat says Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana, or Nechunya ben Hakana gives another answer. He says even more radically, he says Tzedakah teromim goy, tzedakah will elevate the nation. The chesed l'Yisrael, and loving kindness for the Jew. Ule'umim chatat. And for the non-Jews, they only have sin. They don't even have chesed. Even the chesed goes on the first part of the statement, and even non-Jews do not have chesed. They only have sin. Then says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to his students, he says, I like that last view because that makes the Jews look great. They get chesed, they get tzedakah, and it's nothing left for the non-Jewish nation. It's incredible. But it says he likes this better than even his own view. And the Gemara ends up by saying, well, what do you mean? Apparently Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had his own view. What was his own view? Now listen to his own beautiful view. His own view says, the last line, Keshem shechatat mechaperet al Yisrael, kach tzedakah mechaperet al umot ha'olam. His view would be that just like when Jews give tzedakah and it's a kapara for them, they do a good deed, it serves as an atonement. So too like a korban chatat. When non-Jews do chesed, they don't have Torah, they don't have maybe the same avodah we have in terms of tefillah, Tefillah and Korbanos, but when they do Chesed, he said he understands it means it's a Chatat. It's like a Korban Chatat. It's like an atonement for them. I think we can all accept that. That sounds very nice. And yet he said, I like the other view of my Talmud better. Now, I don't know if he meant, I like my Talmud's view better, and he really meant it. After all, he had his own view. Or perhaps he meant that, my Talmud said this, very nice, because actually it elevates the Jews as well. But his own view was that this is his explanation. And in fact, if you look at the Mefarshim on this pasuk in Mishlei, the Ibn Ezra does not quote the Gemara. He says that it means like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that it's a chatat, it's an atonement for the nations. If you look at others, the Meiri says on this Gemara that it has nothing to do with this idea. The Meiri says it has to do with idolaters especially give tzedakah after they could steal something and then give it as tzedakah and they have no prohibition. That's what the Meiri says it's talking about. He says that's their chatat. Shim Shofar Hirsch has a beautiful explanation concerning this pasuk. No one, from what I know, quotes this Gemara to indicate, among other things, that the soul of a non-Jew is different. What the Baal Tanya has done, and the Zohar has done, and the Baal Kabbalah from this source, which you might have said, okay, so it says non-Jews don't have the same kavanas as Jews when they give tzedakah, when they do chesed. No, but this source says they have a different soul, according to them. That by the way that their kavanas are, that they don't do it for the sake of heaven, but only to become great, that reflects the fact that they, in fact, inherently and ontologically are different in nature than the Jew is. In source number 5, there's a Tosafot of Avodah Zarah which says, I'm just going to point out quickly, that the souls of Jews and non-Jews come from different reservoirs, come from different places. Again, it might be an indication that there is a difference between the soul of a Jew and the soul of a non-Jew. If you go over to the middle in the Kuzari says clearly, for those who do not know, that the soul of a Jew is different than the soul of a non-Jew. Thereby he says, amazingly, we know the Middle Ages distinguished between 4 different levels of being. There was Domeim, there was Sameach, there was Chaya, there was Medaber. That is to say, there's inanimate objects, there is plant life, there's animal life, and then there's the speaker, which is the human being. And we know the Kuzari believe there was another level, Yisrael, which is the 5th level above all other levels of existence. And thereby he says in source number 7 that only a Navi, only a prophet can only come from the Jewish people. Even though someone who converts, he says, even can become a Chassid, a good person, whatever, but to be a Navi, he says only a Jew can become a Navi. Again, reflecting, it seems, the difference he holds between the soul of a Jew and the soul of a non-Jew. The Ramchal in source number 8, this is now from the 18th century also, if you look through it, that the souls of Jews are distinct and different from the souls of non-Jews. I'm trying to show you this is a point of view that is throughout the literature. It's not just held by the Baal Tanya. And what about the Mishnah that says in source number 9 in Avos, we all know it. It's Rabbi Akiva speaking, Hu haya omer, Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. It says that how precious is the human being who was created in the image of God. What about the fact that it says every human being is in the image of God? You would seem to see he has some divine soul which is on a very high level. So in fact, Rav Schechter, when I spoke to him last year, he quoted this Mishnah, and he says, it says here, we know that the Mishnah you have Jews who have a certain soul. It says non-Jews have a tzelem, but then we know the Mishnah goes on to say that Chiba Yetera was given to the Jewish people, right? Because they received the Torah. In the next paragraph, Chavim Yisrael, Shenatan Lahem Kli Chemda, they received the Torah. They had a certain Kli to help elevate themselves even greater. So Schechter said, so you see that it's true that Jews are on a higher level in terms of their soul, as Schechter said, than that of a non-Jew. Again, he was just confirming everything that we have seen so far. By the way, look at the Midrash Shmuel, source number 10, Hatzelem Ha'amor Kan, shockingly. The image talking about here, the image of God, Hutzelem Shel Kedusha Hamyuchad La'am B'nei Yisrael Livadam. It's not talking about non-Jews. Even though it's talking about Tzelem Elokim. What are you talking about? Every human being is endowed with Tzelem Elokim. He says no. Midrash Shmuel says it's talking about Jews who have that Kedusha. Jews have that Kedusha. Alright? Not non-Jews. So again, all would seem to be confirming everything that we said. I could give you others, the Siftei Chaim, Rav Pinkus, even Rav Wolbe. If you look at his sources, you will see him quoting the Gemara Baba Batra, and many times quoting this idea that the soul of a Jew is on a higher level. In source number 11, you see this is quoted by the Nefesh HaChaim, Rav Chaim Volozhiner, the same lashon as the Balatanya. The Balatanya and Rav Chaim Volozhiner responded to Kabbalah. If you don't know, the words of the Nefesh HaChaim were a response to a degree of the understanding of Kabbalah that the Hasidim had. It was not just a question of singing and dancing. It was a much greater understanding of Tzimtzum, and what Tzimtzum meant, if it meant that God actually absented himself from the world, or if God just hid himself in the world. And there are ramifications of that even in terms of practical halakha, what you say in Kaddish and so on. But in any event, the Nefesh HaChaim says the exact same thing in terms of the connection of a Jew to the Ribbono Shel Olam. But the only thing he says at the very end, if you look, he says that he mamish has a connection to the Ribbono Shel Olam kiviyachol. That's the only difference. Where the Balatanya says mamish, as we're used to hearing from Chabad, mamish, and he says mamish, kiviyachol, as it were. That little distinction may mean something. In any event, Rav Avraham Grudzinski in source number 12 says clearly, Yisrael, you see, Yitzira Chadasha hi Nishmat Yisrael, the Jew is a new creation, Yitzira She'ein Kamoa B'chol Mina Enoshi, a creation of which there is nothing like in the entire world, Shameshubach Umuvkar Misuga Adam, because the most praiseworthy of a human being in this world, Eino Magia Lahapachot Shebechutim Misug Yisrael. He does not come to the lowest level of a Jew who is on a very low madrega. Is that a statement or what? The greatest non-Jew does not reach the heels of the lowest Jew. Now, this is side one view. I find this problematic. I think some of you might agree with me. We find this problematic. But is there another view who disagrees with this view? Here's the other view I suggest in the rationalist school, namely the Rambam, but others as well. At source number 13, first of all, the Tiferes Yisrael, on that Mishnah Avos that we saw, says, with regards to Tzelem Elokim, Hainu Afilu Aku. He says, clearly it even means a non-Jew has that Tzelem. As we see, the end of the Mishnah says, Chaviv Yisrael. It distinguishes between Tzelem, which means all human beings, and a special element which is in the non-Jew. Of course, that still does not necessarily say that they have the same soul. It's saying that they do have a certain Tzelem Elokim, which we would all probably have admitted before coming to this year. But basically the idea that they have a different soul, that's still something we have to grapple with. Now let's look at the Rambam. The Rambam says in source 14, he says, Nefesh kol basar hi tzuratosh natan lo akel. He says the soul, he uses this word nefesh to mean soul. The soul, he says, of every human being is that which God gave it. And he goes on to say that it is described and reflected in the knowledge that a person has. He says, V'altsura zo nemar b'Torah nasa adam b'tzalmeinu b'dumotenu. He says, in this notion that within the human being that we are the image of God, he says that is defined by the knowledge that a person has. I think none of us are surprised by the fact that we know the Rambam championed the intellectual connection to Hashem, and his famous palace parable in the Morning Vuchim is an indication of this more than anything else. And thereby the Rambam says, and by the way, he emphasizes not Jew and non-Jew, but the human being in general. Every human being we know has this intellectual capacity to connect, and thereby already initially I would start seeing the Rambam being someone who has a different view. If you look at source number 15 in Ilchos Tshuva, Parakeh, the Rambam says, Halacha Bet, he says, a person should not think like most people think, he says, that the Kadosh Baruch Hu causes a person to be a certain way, and then at the very end he says, Ela kol adam ra'ui lo lihiyot sadi kemoshe Rabbeinu. Rather, every human being, not Kol Yisrael, Kol Adam, any person has the ability to be like Moshe Rabbeinu. And Rav Aharon Soloveitchik, in his Pirkei Aron, he mentions there that it cannot mean that really a person can be like Moshe Rabbeinu. Because we know, how can a person be like Moshe Rabbeinu? No one's ever like Moshe Rabbeinu. Now some answer and say that it says in the Torah, a Navi will never come like Moshe Rabbeinu. But a Tzaddik like Moshe Rabbeinu, it could be. A Baal Chesed like Moshe Rabbeinu, there could be. Rav Aharon Aharon says it cannot mean that. Moshe Rabbeinu is the greatest Navi, who is also the greatest Tzaddik. It just means everyone can reach his or her potential like Moshe Rabbeinu. That's what Rav Aharon says. I only saw this last week that Rav Soloveitchik, in a Motzei Shabbos shir that he once gave, specifically said he does not hold like that. Because he was told, telling over the famous story of Zushia, that when you come to the world to come, they're not going to say, why weren't you Moshe Rabbeinu? They're going to say, why weren't you Zushia? And Rav Soloveitchik said that Zushia story cannot be believed if you go with the Rambam. He says, because the Rambam says that they are going to ask you, why weren't you like Moshe Rabbeinu? Because the Rambam says anyone can be like Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Rav held apparently not like Rav Aharon, like his brother. He says, it says here you could be like Moshe Rabbeinu. In any event, my only point is that certainly the Rambam says that any human being can reach this level. He does not mention Yisrael. The davar zeh ikar gadol hu amud haTorah va'amitzvah. The idea that any human being can become the greatest person, this is essential to our faith. So if anyone has a problem saying, well, the Kabbalists say this, where's the Rambam come up with? The Rambam says this is fundamental to an understanding of Judaism, the idea that any human being, the Rambam says, can reach the highest level. The Rambam says in source 16, the Rambam says clearly that is a foundation of our belief, based on, he goes on to say, the intellect and knowledge a person has, that God reveals His will to human beings, as opposed to the Kuzari. He does not just reveal it to Jews, but even to non-Jews. And you have to understand that the Rambam means that to get Nevuah, according to the Rambam, you have to have the greatest intellectual development possible. So certainly non-Jews, according to the Rambam, we know it from Aristotle, who the Rambam praised was the greatest non-Jewish mind that ever lived. So the Rambam certainly holds it when it's capable of reaching this high level with a non-Jew as well. If you don't believe it, look at source 17. The Rambam in Igeret Teman points out, he says there that we do not believe in the prophecies of certain Arab prophets, not because, he says, she'einam Yisrael, not because they are not Jews. That's ridiculous, the Rambam says, because he goes on to point out that in the book of Eov there are multiple individuals there who we believe are prophets, and even though they are not Jews, the book of Eov proves, he says, that non-Jews can be prophets and reach the highest level of existence. In fact, it's interesting because, there's Machlokas, the Gemara Baba Batra says, or those who hold, that the book of Eov never occurred. It was all a mashal. It never happened. There never was anyone named Eov. Many Mepharshim disagree with that. But in any event, that the Rambam himself says in some of his writings that he agrees with this view, that Eov was a parable, that Eov never lived. Yet he's willing in his Igeret Teman to say that it's enough that you see from the book of Eov, again, maybe if it even never happened, but that there were non-Jewish prophets in the book of Eov, that's enough to tell me that non-Jews also can be prophets. And the greatest proof that there could possibly be, source number 18 in the Rambam, the famous Rambam from the end of Shemitah and Yobel, where he says, V'lo shevet Levi bilvad, ela kol ish v'ish v'kol ba'ei ha'olam. The Rambam says, what else do you want? The Rambam says that not only Shevet Levi was put aside to study Torah and to intensify their relationship to Hashem, they didn't get land, they didn't have to work the land and so on, but basically everyone, Kol Ba'olam, anyone who has come into this world, the Rambam says, not Kol Yisrael, Rabbosai, anyone who is a part of this world has the ability, he says, if he applies himself to serve Hashem, to walk in His ways. And if you look now 4 lines down, he says that such an individual, even a non-Jew, anyone in this world, Hareza Nikadesh Kodesh Kodashim, that individual becomes sanctified with the Holy of Holies. Can you describe a non-Jew according to Kabbalah of being Kodesh Kodashim, a person who doesn't have the same soul as a Jew? He says anyone can be Kodesh Kodashim. And now look at this amazing statement. V'yiyeh Hashem chelko v'nachalato li'olam u'mei olamim. And then he says, and then God will be his portion and his inheritance. Rabbosai, what did the Baal HaTanya say? What did the Kabbalists say? They use the same pasuk, the same idea. They say that every Jew is a chelek of Hashem. Remember that? Every Jew is a Chelek Hashem. We said there's a problem with that because, what do you mean he's a Chelek from Hashem? Hashem is one entity. He can't divide himself up. So look at the Rambam. Almost speaking against this. The Rambam says, you're not a Chelek from Hashem. You now have a Chelek in Hashem. You are not a chelek of Hashem. You now have a right to say that Hashem is yours forever and ever. As a result, this goes directly against the Kabbalists and the Baal HaTanya. It's almost like the Rambam knew of it, and he wrote it in order that one should not make that mistake. Incredible. Where does the Rambam get it from? After all, the Kabbalists, they have the Arizal from his writings. They go back. They have a source. Does the Rambam make it up? The Rambam is often accused, right? He made this up. Where did he get it from? What's his source? He got it from the philosophers. Chas v'shalom. The Rambam always has a source. For those who do not know, by the way, where the Kabbalists say they got theirs going back to Har Sinai, the Rambam holds that philosophy was not something created by the Greeks, but was part of knowledge going back to Shlomo HaMelech, which he received the Kabbalah from others. Tversky points this out in many of his works on the Rambam, that philosophy is something that the Jews had. It is not something, chas v'shalom, that was made up and then brought over into our tradition. And thereby the Rambam, that's why he had such great faith in philosophy. Where did the Rambam get this idea from of the notion that you could have a non-Jew who could be the Holy of Holies and be on the high level that a Jew could be, which the Kabbalists obviously you can't be. You don't have the soul of a Jew. So it says the Gemara Sanhedrin, source 19, Hayab Rabbi Meir Omer Minayim Shafilu Ovid Kochavim. Now the Meshech Chochmah says it should be read not Ovid Kochavim, but it should be read a Ben Noach. How do we know that even a Ben Noach, Ba'osek B'Torah Shehu Kekohen Gadol? How do we know that even a non-Jew who is involved in Torah can be like the Kohen Gadol? What was the language of the Rambam? Kodesh Kodashim. Who goes into the Kodesh Kodashim? Only the Kohen Gadol. So obviously this is the Rambam's source. How do we know that any person can do that? It says these are the mitzvahs a person should do and live by them. Kohanim Levim V'Yisraelim Lo Nemar Ela Ha'adam. It doesn't say only Jews can reach the level of Kodesh Kodashim. It says that any human being can reach the level of Kodesh Kodashim. That is the source I'm suggesting for the Rambam, and the Rambam clearly holds that a Jew or a non-Jew can reach that high level. We saw that they both have the same soul. That soul is defined by its intellect. A non-Jew has an intellect just like a Jew has an intellect. And to the degree that one develops that intellect, one will reach the level of Nevuah and his closeness to Hashem. The Tana B'Eliyahu in source number 20 says a similar idea, Meid ani alai et hashamayim v'et haaretz, bein goy ubein Yisrael, bein ish ubein isha, bein ebed bein shivcha, hakol lefi maaseh she'oseh. Kach ruach hakodesh shora alav. The Rambam makes clear, I say it again, this is his source, the Tana B'Eliyahu as well, that it is dependent upon one's actions that one reaches the level of ruach hakodesh and nevuah. It is not because something is inherent, biological in the soul of the individual from his birth, but something that is developed by the actions, hakol b'idei shemayim chutz meyirat shemayim, by the choices that an individual makes, be it a Jew, be it a non-Jew, that will elevate him to the highest level possible. This is consistent with the Rambam throughout his works. For example, in source 21, the famous quote from the Rambam in Hilchos Mikvaos. The Rambam says there, Davar barur b'galui shatumot ba'tarot digzerot hakatuzim. The Rambam says it is clear. The idea of something being impure has nothing to do, he goes on to say, with something being dirty, something being disgusting, something being filthy. As we know, it is gzeras hakasuv. It is something that God decreed that halacha should have a certain status given to something. It doesn't mean something's dirty or disgusting. It does not mean at all, the Rambam says. It has no meaning that there's some inherent filth to this thing. The Torah defines it as such, and therefore we relate to it as such. And Dr. Menachem Kellner, in his works on the Rambam, has pointed out that the Rambam does this by language, by the Hebrew language, and by other elements as well, by Eretz Yisrael, that Eretz Yisrael does not have something inherently different about it, but we are told to treat it a certain way, and he does this by many other issues and concepts in halacha. But you see, the Rambam says it's true by elements of Tuma and Tara, and I am suggesting that this is confirmed by the Rambam's view of the soul. Similarly, the Rambam's view of the soul is the same thought, that there is no Kedusha or no Tuma or Tara, which is something inherent in the human being, but it's something that in fact is earned by the human being in accordance with his deeds. To support this, the Meshech Chochmah, in source number 22, the famous Meshech Chochmah says as follows. You may know it. The Meshech Chochmah says that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he came down from Har Sinai and he saw that the Jews were worshiping the ego, he breaks the tablets. What was the message of breaking the tablets? Were they just too heavy? Did he just do it to show that you're not deserving of these tablets? And the Meshech Chochmah has the most amazing explanation, which definitely goes with the Rambam, and there is no doubt in my mind that he was thinking of the Rambam, and in fact the source we just quoted. The Meshech Chochmah says that Dafka, Moshe Rabbeinu, broke these luchos in order to show that there is nothing, even in halacha, nothing, even something that was written by the Ribono Shalom himself, which inherently has Kedusha to it and in it. Even these tablets which were written by the Ribono Shalom, look, I will break them. There is no Kedusha in these tablets. They're only given a certain status because they were written by the Ribono Shalom. But if you do not behave properly toward these luchos, as you are not behaving properly now, then these luchos can be destroyed. Then they are meaningless, and they have no essence in terms of their Kedusha to them. In fact, it's fascinating. This statement of the Meshech Chochmah, this statement is said about the breaking of the luchos. How important is it to remember this idea of why Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchos? Rabbosai, according to Rashi, it is the very last thing we are supposed to remember when we complete the Torah. As you know, in Vizos HaBracha, source number 23, it says, the Jewish people are told to remember the great things Moshe Rabbeinu did for them, including the thing that he did with his mighty hand. What did Moshe Rabbeinu do with his mighty hand? Maybe you would say, well, he split the sea, he held up the staff. No. Rashi's famous statement in source number 24, Lishbor haluchot leinehem, that Moshe Rabbeinu shattered the tablets. This was the great thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did in his life, and I'm suggesting with the Meshech Chochmah, as he explains it as such, that we are thereby supposed to leave the Torah after reading it. According to Rashi, is just a koach Moshe Rabbeinu for breaking these luchos. The Meshech Chochmah explaining and teaching that there is no inherent kedusha, ontological kedusha, in anything in this world. It's something that is given a certain status that we behave ourselves toward in a certain way, but is not ontologically so within the essence of that object. And again, I am saying all this to confirm the idea that I'm bringing forth from the Rambam, that as opposed to the Kabbalist, where the soul of a Jew is something that is inherently higher, as we saw, than that of a non-Jew, the Rambam says clearly in various sources that rationalist school, as it should be understood, with their emphasis on the intellect, which is shared, of course, by all human beings, we should understand that if that is the connection to Hashem, that consequently even non-Jews can reach that level. Can you make some type of harmony between the two? You can't, in my opinion. And those who try to are not going to succeed. There have been efforts to try to show, no, the Rambam really felt like the Kabbalists, he just wrote in a different language. To me, this is really watering it down. Rabbosai, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. We have to recognize, it took me a long time to get to this because it still kind of tears me apart inside, that we are part of a tradition that has different perspectives in it. You have one perspective as emphasized by the Kabbalists, that the Jew has a different soul, and you have on the other hand, those who are rationalists, who have a different opinion that one, due to his intellect, can develop and reach the highest level. We have to understand, I think, both of these views as being part of our tradition, and my purpose in giving the shir was to show that there is indeed a perspective that a Jew or a non-Jew has the ability to reach, as he says, Kodesh Kodashim, the holiest levels of the connections with Ribono Shalom. Now, a non-Jewish soul is not on a lower level than the soul of a Jew, that both are defined by the acts that they do, and that both have the potential to reach the Kodesh Kodashim, to become authentic Abdei Hashem.